the idea of Seder, the idea of order. It's called the Seder. There's an order. There are steps. 15 steps. Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. There's a procedure. There's an order. But the idea of order, the Sfas Emes says, is very much related to the idea of freedom. We all have this experience in our work of sometimes not being the master of our own time. We're sitting in our offices and lurching from crisis to crisis, and everybody else's problem is now my problem. You know, I'm speaking as a principal of a school. So, you know, there are things I would like to do over the course of a day, but this teacher has a problem, and this student has a problem, and there's a leak in the roof, and so on and so forth. So, you're not the master of your own time. As a result, you cannot follow your own Seder. You can't follow your own agenda. You can't follow your own order, your own procedure. When you are a master, so you can set up a plan for yourself and follow it. I'm going to do this first, and this second, and this third, and this fourth, and this fifth. So the very idea of order, the idea of Seder, is very closely related to the idea of freedom. It's also related to the mental state of being free. Forget the question of whether a person is subject to external constraints on his freedom. You know, there are people who just don't have the internal wherewithal to guide their lives in a productive direction. In that sense, they're also not free. You know, they are battered back and forth by their own troubles. You know, the ability to have the clarity of freedom of thought, to be able to plan, to set an agenda, is an amazing, amazing blessing. And therefore the idea of Seder, order, agenda, is really the hallmark of freedom. And therefore it's not by accident, says the Sfas Emes, that is the nature of the Seder night. There is an order, there is a procedure, we follow it, step by step. That's the symbol of our truly being free, that we are in control of our own time, of our own lives, our own destiny, and that is what it means to be a free person. So the Seder is really an exercise in freedom. Having said that, I want to point out that the opposite is also true. That sometimes you can be a prisoner to Seder. You know, we have a procedure we have to follow, and nothing is going to stop us, even our own welfare is not going to get in the way of our following the plan. And as a consequence, a lot of the promise that the Seder night holds out is often lost, because we are too rigid and too insistent that we follow the rules, that we follow the Seder, we follow the order, and we're unwilling to be flexible. It's an amazing thing. The Gemara says the following. The Gemara tells the story that Rav Nachman had a servant. His name was Daru, the name of the servant. And this Daru we know from elsewhere. He was not the most conscientious servant. He used to like to drink, and he used to like to dance. He wasn't the hardest of workers. But in any case, Rav Nachman said to him one Pesach night, he said, listen, he said, what do you say in the following situation? You have a servant whose master set him free and gave him a lot of money. Well, what should that servant do? So the servant said, well, he should be very grateful, he should thank, he should praise his master for emancipating him. So Rav Nachman said, you've exempted us from saying the Manashtana. We can now proceed with the rest of the Seder. Why is that? Why does this amazing insight by this servant exempt us from saying Manashtana? The answer is very simple. You see, why do we ask questions at the Seder? Why are questions so important? Chazal tell us it's very important. It's a halacha of the Seder that the Seder must be conducted in the manner of question and answer. Why is that so important? The answer is very simple. That by asking questions, we try to guarantee our being engaged in the Seder. In other words, it's one thing to listen to a lecture, but it's something else if we ask questions that kind of sparks our curiosity, and then we're waiting for the answer already. So the question is just a way of, in a sense, hooking the person into the Seder. It's a way of capturing his attention. He's asked the question, now he wants the answer. Well, Seder of Nachman, you can dispense with the formal questions. You don't have to ask the Manishtana the way it's printed in the Haggadah. If somehow you can bring the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim down to earth, make it relevant to that participant, then you're exempted from the formal obligation of asking questions. So this Daru, he was a servant. He was a servant who would have liked to be free. Maybe in a sense he already was very free, as we said. He used to drink and he used to dance in saloons and bars. So he was probably more free than a slave in any case. But when he was asked this hypothetical, like, what would you do if you were in that situation? You were a servant and you were freed and your master gave you a lot of money. What would you do? And he said, I would be very grateful. I would express my gratitude. That's it. He's hooked. He's already engaged because the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim has now been made relevant to him where he's at. So you can dispense with the formalities. You don't need the text of the Haggadah if you can make the story relevant to the participants where they are given their own life situation. Now this is the problem. The problem is that we have a book, it's called the Haggadah, and we feel we have to follow it, and we have to read every word, and as a consequence, the spontaneity, the personal relevance is gone. You know, I think there are a lot of people that think the following, that let's say you had a group of people in a room and it's Pesach night and you're having the Seder, and instead of reading the Haggadah text, we would talk about what freedom means to me personally, what's going on in my own life, and so on and so forth. We would consider that a little bit avant-garde, that somehow we didn't do it like it's meant to be done. We didn't do it by the book, we didn't follow the rules, it wasn't really a kosher Seder. I think the point of the Gemara is the exact opposite. If somehow you can bring the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim down to earth, making it relevant to all the participants, you can dispense with the formalities. Like Rabbi Nachman said, put trust in the Manishtana. We don't have to say the Manishtana now. Because the whole purpose is to make it relevant to the participants. If you've made it relevant some other way, then you don't have to follow the text. You don't have to follow the rules. So on the one hand, yes, we want to feel free to live lives of order, but we don't want to become prisoners to order. We don't want to become prisoners to rigidity. We want to have the flexibility. And part of that is that let the Seder go where it goes. But it doesn't have to necessarily end up on page 70, whatever, right? It can end up where it ends up. And it could still be a very, very meaningful Seder. And very often, if you have guests and people who, for whom the Hebrew is daunting, and the text is a little bit irrelevant, then by all means, bring it to their level, bring it to where they're at with a little creativity. And it's not just a b'di eved Seder. It's not just like a good enough Seder. It'll be the best Seder imaginable. It'll be exactly what the Seder was meant to be. The text really was composed for people that lack creativity, for people that need to be walked through it step by step. So the Chazal said, here's you follow this Seder, you'll be all right. You've covered the essentials. But if you can have a Seder which really is personalized and made relevant to people in their current situations, that would be a fantastic Seder, nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be embarrassed about. So finding that balance between order and flexibility really is the challenge of anybody who is conducting a Seder. Pardon?
Are you positing that this would be okay to do, or are you just...
I'm saying that That's what it should be. In other words, obviously, there are certain things that you have to cover. You have to mention the fact, yes, we were in Egypt and we came out. Right? If you skip over that, then you will have missed an essential point. But I think there is a lot in the Haggadah that, if it's of interest, then by all means discuss it. If it's not of interest, then don't bother with it. Okay?
You've got to be careful that you don't lose the children, the 6-year-olds and the 8-year-olds, if you do it at a higher level.
You don't want to lose anybody.
Yeah.
You don't want to lose the 90-year-olds either. Very, very important not to lose them. Now, you're pointing out a fact that it is very, very difficult to conduct a Seder for an audience which is all over the place. You have little children, you have adults, etc. Well, you have to do it in layers. In other words, there are going to be parts of the Seder that are directed to the children, usually the earlier parts, before they drop off. Then the later parts will be directed to the adults. In some cases, it's the opposite. In some cases, it's the children who are up, and it's the adults that fall asleep. We're all familiar with that too. But I think it's worthwhile to reflect and to plan, because then you can have a very meaningful Seder. If you go into it cold, without any forethought, you'll take out of the experience as much as you invested, which is nothing. Right? But if you really think about it, and these are the people that are going to be there. Like, what would I like to accomplish? I'm not talking about trivializing it. I'm not a believer in, plastic frogs and that kind of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. Some people like that. Fine. If you're into that, by all means. But maybe I'm naive, but I still think that ideas are compelling, even for people at very young ages. You just have to make it relevant to them and express it in a way they can understand. I don't think you have to dumb it down, in a sense, by making it silly. I think you might have to reduce it. Now, this is an idea, by the way, that I'll just share with you, that Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz once said the following. He said that the lower the level of the student, the greater the teacher has to be. He says, we think the opposite. We think that if you're teaching university, then you have to be a master teacher. You have to teach at a high level. If you're teaching high school, you don't have to be as good a teacher. If you're teaching elementary school, you can be a dummy. Says Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz, it's the exact opposite. If you're taking an idea which is very, very sublime, very sophisticated, and you have to reduce it to the level of the audience, so the lower the level of the audience, the more skill that requires. You have to be a real master. It says, Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest teacher in history because he had to take the loftiest ideas, which were the Ribono Shel Olam's ideas, and bring them down to the level of human beings. So to be able to do that, to take divine ideas and bring them down to earth, that required a master teacher. Moshe Rabbeinu was the supreme teacher. So this is something that we all have to do, but with thought, you can all do it. This is not rocket science. It just means a little bit of planning, a little bit of attention, and then we can be successful. And sometimes it may be that before Pesach, we should learn the Haggadah, cover it well, and then the nuggets of gold that are scattered throughout then can be pointed out at the Seder, and the other parts that will lose the crowd can be glossed over. But the main thing is that engage your audience, involve them, bring it down to earth, make it relevant. Don't feel bound or constrained by the Hebrew text. To the contrary, if you say it in Hebrew and your audience does not understand Hebrew, no one will have done the mitzvah. Whereas if you skip the Hebrew and everyone understands what is being discussed, then you will have done the mitzvah in the best possible way. Yes?
We don't say it about davening. We don't. You wouldn't say.
Well, listen. I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret. And let it be on the tape. The reality is like this. The reality is, if a person prays in Hebrew and does not understand Hebrew, the person has fulfilled the obligation of reciting his prayers in the most technical sense. But he hasn't prayed for any of it. In other words, now this is going to sound bizarre. When the Chazal said that you have to recite the Shemona Esrei, Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv, the Chazal did not say that you have to pray. They said you have to say your prayers. The hope is, if you're saying the prayers, you'll pray at the same time. But you can't make a person pray. You can make a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? You can have a person and tell him you have to say your prayers, but you can't make the person pray. Because to pray means there's emotional involvement, you're engaged in the prayer, you're communicating with God. And that's something which can't be made obligatory. The Chazal said that 3 times a day you have to read your prayers. If you're already reading your prayers, there's a good chance you'll pray too. So if a person reads his prayers in Hebrew, in, again, the most technical sense, he will have fulfilled the rabbinic obligation of reciting his prayers. But he won't have prayed. If he doesn't know what he's saying, what has he prayed for? What has he asked for? What has he expressed to God? What has he communicated to God? Nothing. In theory, therefore, if a person has a choice of reading the prayers in unintelligible Hebrew or reading them in English, it is 1,000% better to read them in English. And that's halacha l'maisa. That is the halacha. The reason that the sifrei halacha, the halachic writings, do not say this emphatically is because of a historical problem. That in the 1800s, the Reform movement tried to do away with Hebrew and conduct services totally in the vernacular. And because there were many, many other issues with which Orthodoxy took issue with Reform, so one of the strategies that the Orthodox used was to dig our heels in and not relent, not give in. So as a consequence, we drew all sorts of lines. This we're not going to do, and this we're not going to do, and this we're not going to do. And one of the things was, we are not going to introduce the vernacular into the prayer service. We are going to conduct the prayers in Hebrew, no matter what. This is where we're going to draw the battle lines. And the consequence has been disastrous. But maybe it was the correct strategy. Who knows? Maybe if we hadn't drawn that line, the whole nature of the Jewish community would be transformed. But this is one of the consequences, and therefore, as a result, in Sifrei Halacha, you're not going to find, certainly not on the communal level, an advocacy of conducting prayers in vernacular in English. But on the personal level, certainly, if a person has a choice of praying in English or in Hebrew, and the person does not understand Hebrew, it's certainly better to pray in English. Having said that, the best thing is to learn Hebrew. That's like God's language, right? You want to talk to him on his terms. You should learn his language. But in the meantime, certainly it's preferable to pray in English than to say the prayers in Hebrew, which you don't understand. And the Haggadah is certainly that way. The Haggadah is not a recitation. It's not. There's no magic in the words. We are communicating ideas, and therefore that has to be done in a language people understand. If you really say the words no one understands, then you're missing the boat. There's a lot in the Haggadah to talk about, so over the next couple of weeks, I'd like to highlight certain parts of the Haggadah, and let's see if we can extract some ideas that will have some relevance. Maybe with a little bit of ingenuity, we can translate them into our Seder. I'd like to talk tonight about the 4 sons. Now, the 4 sons, the Arba Banim, is a part of the Haggadah which is really not that important in the vast scheme of things. Because the mitzvah of the night is to talk about the enslavement in Egypt and the liberation from Egypt. And the section of the four sons is a discussion of the mitzvah of discussing the Exodus. It's not a fulfillment of the mitzvah, it's a discussion about the mitzvah. It's like reading a restaurant review in comparison to eating a meal. Not quite the same thing. So instead of discussing the Yetzias Mitzrayim, we're talking about the mitzvah of discussing the Yetzias Mitzrayim. But it is relevant. It is relevant. Because the fact is that the Seder night is the one time a year where parents do not abdicate their responsibility. Now, the Torah says the mitzvah of teaching Torah is the mitzvah on parents to children. V'shinatam levonacha, you shall teach Torah to your children. They shall speak of them. So the mitzvah is really parents teach the children. The ideal is homeschooling. The ideal is homeschooling. Chazal say that it was realized a long time ago that this is not a perfect system. Not every parent is able to teach his child. Not every parent is qualified to teach his child. Parents have other responsibilities. So it doesn't always work. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamliel ordained a system of public education where schools were established. And now you have teachers who discharge this responsibility for parents. It's become a little complicated nowadays. I think Rabbi Yeshua ben Gamliel's ordinance, it was really like a public system. It was paid for by the entire population. Now we've changed the model, and it's become a parental obligation to pay tuition for children, and that has its own difficulties. But in any case, we send our kids to schools, and we hope that their teachers will teach them what we want them to know. And of course, that means that the most important choice, or the most important decision, the most important contribution parents make to their children's education is choosing a school. And after that, there's very little you can do. I mean, you can give support, you can do homework with your child, do homework for your child, as the case may be, but that's it. The most important choice you make is choosing a school for your child. After that, it's pretty much up to the school what the child will learn and know, whether they'll know anything. But one night a year, we fulfill our obligation. That's the Seder night. You shall teach your children. And this is the one thing we do. And sometimes I joke that the schools teach so much to our children before Pesach that sometimes instead of being parents teaching their children, it's children teaching their parents, which is odd, but I think to a certain extent it's still the case, that parents transmit values to their children. The word ben, which means a child, the Mefarshim explain it comes from Miloshen binyan. Binyan is to build. Binyan is to build. Ben, binyan, the two are phonetically related. Because we build our children. We raise our children very much the way that you raise the structure. You lay a foundation, and you build the first floor, second floor, first floor, etc., and you build an entire structure. That's what children are. Children are that which we construct, that which we build. And the Pesach is a time for laying foundations. And there are different types of children, and different types of children have to be addressed in different ways. So the author of the Haggadah tells us, Keneged Arba Banim Dibur Torah. The Torah speaks of 4 different types of children, how to speak to each, how to address their needs, and that's very, very important to know. You have to be able to address the child where the child is at. Now, if the Torah says that there are 4 types of children, you have the chacham, the wise son, and the wicked son, and the simple son, and the child who can't ask, and each one is addressed in a different way, obviously it's important to know your children. Right? If you don't know which category your child falls into, you're going to be giving him the wrong message. So you have to know your children. All right, let's focus for a little bit on the 4 sons. If you have Haggadah in front of you, this is page 28 in the Hebrew, 29 in the English. The Torah tells us, the Torah speaks concerning 4 types of sons, 4 types of children. Daughters could also be included in the category. Echad chacham, one is wise. Echad Rosh, one is wicked. Echad tam, one is simple. Ve'echad she'ein yodei lishayil. Now it's important to notice the contrast. We contrast the wise son to the wicked son. Now, this is very, very odd. I would have said, what is the opposite of a wise son? A unintelligent son. What is the opposite of a evil son, a wicked son? A pious son. Because here the contrast. Chacham and Rasha, at first glance, don't seem to be categories that are mutually exclusive. But Chazal see it not that way. Chazal understand that the key to virtue is wisdom. As if a person knows what is right, he will live accordingly. And therefore, the opposite of the Rasha is the Chacham. The Rasha is wicked because he lacks some wisdom. There's something he doesn't know. Something he hasn't learned. If he would have learned it, if he would know it, he'd be a Chacham. He'd be a tzaddik. And therefore, this is the contrast. You have the Chacham versus the Rasha. The other two are children that are on lower levels of sophistication. One is very simple, the other is so young you can't even ask a question. So they're dealt with on a very, very basic level. But the grown-up children, either you're a Chacham or you're a Rasha. Either you know, or if you don't know, then you're at risk. So let's focus on these 2 tonight. Chacham Mahu Omer. What does the Chacham say? He says, Moha Eidais v'achukim v'hamishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu eschem. What are the testimonies and the decrees and the ordinances which God has commanded you? Now that's a very, very sophisticated question. The Mefarshim explained, the Maral explains it, that we know mitzvahs fall into categories. Right? We have 613 mitzvahs, but we don't apply the same term mitzvah to all of them. There are various types of mitzvahs. We have mitzvahs that are eidais, mitzvahs that are testimonies, meaning they testify to historical facts. So Shabbos, for example, testifies to the historical fact that God created the world in 6 days. So it is an eidus, it is a testimony to that fact. That's really one of the observances on Shabbos Friday night. So after the Shmoneh Esrei at Maariv, we say Vayachulu. That we say it standing, because when you testify in a Jewish court, the testimony is given standing. Right, in a secular court, they let you sit in the witness box, but in a Jewish court, when the witnesses testify, they stand. So we stand and we testify by Yahulu that God created the world in 6 days. There is a practice that many have that they say this at least with one other person. Let's say the person prayed the Shmoneh Esrei a little bit longer than everybody else. So when he comes to say Vayachulu, he'll buttonhole a neighbor and say it along with me. And the reason for that is because in a Jewish court, you never have a single witness testify. You always have 2 witnesses testify. So since this is our testimony, so you want to say it along with one other witness. So Shabbos is a testimony. The mitzvahs of Pesach are also testimonies. They testify to the historical events of the Exodus from Egypt. So they're mitzvahs that fall under the category of eidais. Then there are chukim. Chukim are laws which we observe because we do what we're told. We don't understand why, to us, they seem to have no rhyme or reason. They are just divine decrees that we have to follow obediently. The Maral points out that there are laws of the Korban Pesach. Even though the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, as a rule, generally is an eidos, it's a testimony to the historical events of the Exodus, but there are certain aspects of the Korban Pesach which are inexplicable. We have no idea why they should be. For example, there's a law of the Korban Pesach, you're not allowed to break bones when you eat the Korban Pesach. So why should that be? You break bones, you don't break bones, what difference does it make? So although the Korban Pesach in an overall sense is an edus, it's a testimony, but there are aspects to it which are chukim as well. We don't understand why these rules apply. We observe them obediently. And then there are mishpatim. Mishpatim are rules that govern interpersonal relationships. Most of the mishpatim deal with civil law, criminal law, and those are mishpatim. Korban Pesach has mishpatim too. There are laws. Certain people are allowed to participate in the Korban Pesach. Certain people are not allowed to participate. Right? If a person is uncircumcised, he's not allowed to participate in the Korban Pesach. If a person is an apostate, he's become an idol worshiper, an idolater, he can't participate in the Korban Pesach. These are mishpatim. These are laws. Who is included, who is excluded, and so on and so forth. So the Chacham is asking a very intelligent question. He knows all the laws of the Korban Pesach, or maybe he doesn't know all the laws, but he knows that there are laws that are eidos, there are laws of Pesach, which are testimonies, there are laws that are chukim, and there are laws that are mishpatim. So he's aware of this classification, and he wants to know which mitzvahs fall into which group. What are the eidos, and what are the chukim, and what are the mishpatim? Now this is a question which is a very sophisticated question. So the person who asks such a question, we should certainly assume is a chacham. So what does the author of the Haggadah tell us? It says, tell him all the laws of the Pesach. All the laws of the Pesach. He wants to know what the laws are, tell him the laws. And to the very last halacha, that ein maftirin achar Pesach afikayman, that after the Korban Pesach, we do not eat dessert. When we had the temple and we ate the Passover offering, the meat of the Korban Pesach was the last thing we ate, so that the taste would remain with us. We want the taste to remain on our lips. We don't eat something afterward to cleanse our palates. We want the taste to remain. We want the experience to remain. So therefore, the last thing we eat is the Korban Pesach. Ein maftir nachar Pesach afikayman. The Gemara says that nowadays we don't have the Korban Pesach. Ein maftir nachar matzah afikayman. Right? There is nothing that we eat after the last matzah. Now I have to point out that this is one of those delicious ironies, that afikoman really refers to the dessert that we don't eat. And some very brilliant fellow decided to call that last piece of matzah afikoman, as if to remind us, this is your dessert tonight, matzah. But really, the afikoman, as the word is used in the Talmud, is not a reference to the last piece of matzah. Afikoman is the dessert that you do not eat after that last piece of matzah. Ein maftirin achar Pesach achar matzah afikoman. You don't eat afikoman dessert after the matzah. So, how did it start? Probably some kid at the Seder said, "Where's dessert?" And his mother said, "This is it. This is dessert." That's how it probably started. So nowadays we call that last matzah afikoman. But really afikoman is the dessert that we don't eat after the matzah. And of course, that's the very last halacha. The very last halacha of matzah, I mean, the Seder continues with Hallel and so on and so forth, but the last halacha of matzah, the last halacha of Pesach, is this halacha, you eat nothing afterward, and therefore, if you're telling him all the dinim, this is like the last one. Okay, very straightforward. The kid wants to know what the laws are, you tell him what the laws are. But interestingly enough, if you look in the Chumash gives a different answer. The Chumash does not tell us this answer. the Gebar the Chumash. This is in Parshas V'Eschanan, and it's very, very, very odd. Let me read you what the pasuk says, what the Chumash says. Ki yisholcha bincha machar le'mor.
What page you on?
This is page 976, 977 in the translation. When your son will ask you tomorrow this question, and the Chumash cites the question, what are the testimonies and the statutes, etc. V'amarta levincha, you shall tell your son, Avodim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. V'yotzienu Hashem b'Mitzrayim b'yod chazakah. And God took us out with a strong hand. V'yiten Hashem osos umofsim gedolim v'royim b'Mitzrayim, and God placed great and terrible signs and wonders in Egypt. B'Pharaoh b'chalbeso, upon Pharaoh and his entire household laying before our very eyes. V'osam otzim misham, and God took us out of there. L'man havi osanu, to bring us, losis lanu v'sa'aretz, to give us the land, asher nishba l'avosenu, that He swore to our forefathers. V'yitzavenu Hashem la'asos es kol chukim ha'elim, God commanded us to perform all these commandments. Liyiras Hashem Elokeinu, to fear God. L'tov lanu, for our own good. Kol ha'yomim, our entire lives. L'chayosenu kiyom hazeh, that we should be sustained and live as we live this very day. U'tzedakah tiyeh lanu, and it will be considered a merit for us. Ki nishmor la'asos es kol mitzvah azos, when we observe the commandments, l'fnei Hashem Elokeinu, before the Lord, kasher tzivanu, as God commanded us. So, the Torah tells us a different answer. That when the child asks us, what are the laws? We tell them we were servants to Pharaoh, and God took us out, and He brought us to Eretz Yisrael, and He commanded us to observe the Torah, and it's a merit if we observe the Torah. Now, frankly, aside from the obvious question that why does the Haggadah give one answer and the Chumash a different answer, it seems to me that the Haggadah's answer is a better answer. If the child wants to know what are the laws, tell him what the laws are. What are you giving him a drasha here, a sermon here?
When he asks, is he asking like, what are they for?
No.
What is their purpose? He's asking.
The translation are, what are the laws? Mm-hmm. What are the laws? And the Haggadah says, tell him what the laws are. Now the Malbim points out interestingly that if you look at the text of the Haggadah, there's a very interesting thing. It says, Ve'af atah. Now the English didn't translate that word Ve'af. Ve'af means and also. And also. And also tell him the laws. So how do you begin a sentence with and also? So the Malbim says that the author of the Haggadah made an assumption, which maybe is not a valid assumption. His assumption is, of course you know what it says in the Chumash. Now, again, is that valid? Do we all know? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But of course we know what it says in the Chumash. And of course you're going to tell the child what it says in the Chumash. The Haggadah is telling us, but also tell him what the laws are. That's the va'af, and also. Because of course you're going to tell him what it says in the Chumash, but also tell him the laws. The question is, how do you understand this? So let me just lay down, I think, the important principle, and this is a very, very important principle of chinuch, of education, generally. Now, I always say that every educational institution takes something for granted. I'm the principal of a high school. So a boy comes in grade 9, there are certain assumptions. We assume certain things. We assume that the boy knows how to read. Maybe 95% of the time that is the case. But 5% of the time that isn't the case. So if we take that for granted, it's at our own peril. It may be justified, but it may be that in certain instances the boy needs remedial work. We assume that if the boy is enrolling in a yeshiva, he's interested in what the yeshiva has to offer. He wants to learn Torah. He wants to live as a religious Jew. That probably is true most of the time. But there may be situations where it isn't the case. It may be that the child is here because his parents are forcing him. Maybe this is the last place where the child wants to be. Right? Important to clarify that too. Because we always take things for granted. And the problem is that whenever we take things for granted, we're doing it at our peril. Because when you assume things which are not the case, then you are building structures that have no foundation. There's no foundation. Because you think you have a foundation and you're building on the foundation, but in reality you're building structures, towers, on air. There's no basis, there's no foundation. That's the problem. Now there's a beautiful Gemara. The Gemara says there were two great Talmidei Chachamim, two great Torah scholars, who were very wicked. Doeg and Achitofel. Doeg was the head of the Beis Din of Shaul HaMelech. Achitofel was the head of the Beis Din of David HaMelech. And as the story unfolds, we see that they were both very, very wicked people. So the Gemara says, but they were such great scholars that they were able to discuss 300 questions regarding Migdal HaPareach Ba'avir, regarding the laws of a tower floating in the air. Now what does this mean, a tower floating in the air? Rashi brings 4 different interpretations of what this means. But I once heard from a Rebbe of mine that the point of the Gemara was that whatever they discussed, all their Torah was a tower floating in the air. Because there was no foundation. The foundation would have been devotion to God, love of God, fear of God. That they were lacking. So even though they were quite competent in discussing the nuts and bolts and the technicalities of fine points of Jewish law, but essentially their Torah scholarship had no basis. It was a Migdal Pareach Ba'avir. It was a tower flying in the air. There was nothing to support it. Now, we send our kids to school, and as we said, the school makes certain assumptions. So let's say the basic assumption, which is that the children believe in God, and the children believe in Torah, and the children want to live accordingly, and so on and so forth. So the teacher believes that our job is to teach the kids Jewish law. What bracha do you make on a pineapple? What bracha do you make on a blueberry? What bracha do you make on a bowl of barley mushroom soup? Mushroom barley soup. So, they assume that all the kids need to know other details, but the idea of that you should say a bracha, why you say a bracha, what a bracha means, the idea of expressing gratitude to God, that's taken for granted. We don't have to elaborate on that. All we have to discuss is what bracha do you say on what food. That's taking something for granted, right? And you can't take that for granted. When you take that for granted, then you find yourself in the very upsetting situation where you have a student who's a teenager, he's 17 years old, and he's been in the system his whole life, and then all of a sudden he'll tell you, I don't believe. And like, why should I say a blessing before I eat? So what do you mean, why should you say a blessing? I mean, you've been in school for the last 10 years. And this was never discussed? No, it was never discussed. Right? Because when they came into kindergarten, it was taken for granted. So it was never discussed. So the school has been building a tower on a foundation of air, and there's no basis. And I guess for a certain amount of time, it stays erect, like a road runner running off the cliff who stays in the air for a while before he falls down. So, the tower stays in the air for a while, but after that, it just it goes down. The Baal Tanya writes like this. He says that, he says an idea, really it's a Ramban who says it, that we know that we have 613 mitzvahs. So we have 248 positive commands and 365 negative commands. He says the positive commands, the thou shalt, the things we have to do, are expressions of our love of God. These are expressions of our love of God. The 365 thou shalt nots, these are expressions of our fear of God. So all the mitzvahs rest on two pillars: love of God and fear of God. Right? The mitzvahs aseh, the positive commands, rest on the foundation of love of God. The negative commands rest on the foundation of fear of God. In turn, love and fear of God rest on a single foundation, which is belief in God. Right? You can't talk about love of God or fear of God until you've laid down that we believe that God exists. So Balatanya writes, if you have a system of chinuch which does not begin with emunah, does not begin with belief, and then proceed to love and fear of God, if it jumps ahead to the specific laws of the 613 mitzvahs, so essentially what you're doing is you're building a structure which has no foundation. And that's very, very dangerous, very, very risky. Well, Tanya writes this in the introduction to the Shari Yichud V'Emunah. He writes this idea, the importance of beginning with faith. Comes this very wise son, and he asks all sorts of questions. He wants to know about the rules, the laws. He wants to know what the laws. He says, what are the Eidais, and what are the Chukim, what are the Mishpatim, what are the laws? He wants to know the details. The Torah is not telling me how to answer his question. It's a no-brainer, of course. If a person asks you what time it is, do you need the Torah to tell you how to answer the question? He wants to know what time it is. Tell him what time it is. If he asks you what are the laws, tell him what the laws. I don't need the Torah to tell me that. Right? If a kid asks you what the laws are, so I need the Torah to tell me that when the kid asks you what the laws are, tell him what the laws are. And that's what he asked. Of course, that's how he answered the question. That's not what the Chumash is coming to tell me. The Chumash is telling me something else. The Chumash is telling me that when your son asks you what are the laws, before you answer the question, lay the foundation. Don't take anything for granted. Don't assume that if he's asking what the laws are, he already understands the value of the laws. He already understands the purpose of the laws. He already understands the history behind the laws. Don't take anything for granted. Just because he's asking what the laws are, don't assume he has the foundation. And to the contrary, this is a golden opportunity to lay those foundations. So the Torah says, when the child asks what are the laws, take advantage of the situation. He's expressed interest. Tell him, before we discuss the laws, let me tell you a little history, a little background. We were servants to Pharaoh and Mitzrayim, and God took us out of there, and He gave us a Torah, and He brought us to Eretz Yisrael. And these mitzvahs were given to us for our own good. That's what it says. And it's a merit, it's a merit when we observe them, and so on and so forth. So the Torah isn't telling me how to answer the question. The Torah is telling me that when the child asks a question, this is a golden opportunity. Don't pass up the opportunity. You know, we live in a time that we're all very, very busy. So we tend to think that, okay, we don't have much time for our children. Let it be quality time. Let it be quality time. The truth is that the whole idea is misguided. Because when your child needs you, it's not necessarily going to conform to your schedule. It's not that right now I'm willing and ready to give quality time, so this is the time that my child needs me. Because right now he has no time for you, right? On your schedule. It says, but there'll be a time that he will seek you out. And he's not going to tell you exactly what he wants to know. He's going to beat around the bush. He's going to come and tell you, I'd like to know the details. What are the laws? What are the Eidais? What are the Chukim? What are the Mishpatim? But maybe what the child really wants to know, or if he doesn't want to know, he needs to know, is something which is more fundamental, more basic. So the Torah says that when your child comes and asks you that question, right, start from the beginning. Lay down the foundations. Avodim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh. Give him the historical background. Give him the idea of what it means to be given a mitzvah, that the mitzvahs are for our own good, that it's a merit for us, and so on and so forth. comes the Haggadah, and the Haggadah says, but don't forget to answer the question too. Va'af, also, tell him Kilchas HaPesach, tell him the laws. In other words, don't get so sidetracked that you lay down the foundations and you never get back to the question. So also answer the question and give him the laws and tell him all the details, and even the last halacha. There's no bigger turnoff to a child than the sense that he asks a question and the father instead talks about what he wants to talk about and never gets back to what the child wants to talk about. So take advantage of the opportunity. By all means, lay the foundation, but don't forget to answer the question. But I don't need the Chumash for that. That's what the author of the Haggadah tells us. Va'af, also, in addition to that which the Torah says, also tell him the laws. Answer his question. Now this is extremely, extremely important. Extremely important. This is probably the most important lesson in being mechanech a child. That you can't take anything for granted. You have to assume that if you don't teach it to the child will not have it. He will not know it. Where will he have gotten it from? Where will he have absorbed it from? But we don't live in that type of community where values are imparted by osmosis. Right? Everything has to be spelled out. So if you have a child is sitting at the Seder and he's asking all sorts of technical questions, beautiful. By all means, answer the questions. But don't pass up the opportunity to use the Seder as a vehicle for laying down the most basic values of what it means to be a Jew. And if you think that this isn't necessary, because we all understand that, surprise, surprise, surprise. You find it's not the case. That our children do not have the basics. They don't have the basics. And if the Seder can be a vehicle for laying those down, establishing foundations, then that will be more important than the dealing with the technicalities. By all means, ultimately, you have to answer the question. The child wants to know the details, give them the details. But don't forget the foundations. Don't forget the basics. And that is what the Torah is teaching me. That when the child is asking a question, that's a golden opportunity to take advantage of it. If you seek the child on your schedule, right, when you have time, right, at that point, Dad, I'm going out, meeting my friends, I got other things to do, I have my homework, I have my hockey practice, whatever it is, this is not the time for a drush or for a sermon. When he comes and asks you already, so there is interest, so you can then insert a little bit of value. You can tell him, listen, before we get to answering your question, there's a little background I'd like to give you, and you can slip it in and lay the foundations that what you teach him subsequently about the details will not be a tower built on air, but rather it will be something that has a solid basis. That is a very, very important principle. And I think that's something that if we can think about that at the Seder night, that's what we want to impart, right? We don't want to just impart details about the frogs. Whether it was a lot of little frogs or whether it was one big frog, right? In the vast scheme of things, it's not going to make much of a difference, right? But it's an opportunity to lay down the most fundamental aspects of our belief. You got to take advantage of those opportunities. That's the lesson of the Chacham. The hour is late. Next week we'll proceed to the Rosh and deal with him. Okay. All right.